everybody. Adele Croft from Food Focus, and it's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. Today, we've got the SASDT's first webinar for this year, and there's 3 more to follow. And the sponsor for this webinar is Tate & Lyle. To introduce you to the speaker, as well as to the topic of today, it gives me pleasure to hand over to Christine Leiter now to say something about SASDT and the speaker and the presentation. Christine, thank you so much. Nice to see you. All over to you.
Thank you, Adele, and good afternoon to everybody. This is our first webinar since the SASDT symposium that we held on the 24th of March this year. And just for you to take note that we will be having 2 more, but the next 2 at least, the 28th of July and the 25th of August. You can diarize that in the meantime. This webinar today will explore how plant-based dairy alternatives fit into plant-based diets. It will also elaborate on how this could be interpreted by the dairy consumer and industry from a nutritional perspective, and we have to see if this is a threat or an opportunity. Now, you know, as a dairy community, we are so aware that although animal and plant source foods originate from 2 separate biological kingdoms, these foods offer overlapping supply of essential nutrients that support our health and which can contribute to a more secure and resilient food system. It is also important to know that no single food group can contribute adequate amounts of nutrients essential to human health. So we like to say, so plants and dairy go better together. With that, I welcome Dr. Davide Risso from Tate & Lyle, who is the Senior Research Scientist for Europe, Middle East, and Africa in Tate & Lyle Global Nutrition Team. His full CV is available on the website, so over to you.
Thank you very much and welcome to this webinar. As you said, I'm going to go through this exciting topic, at least for me, and we're going to see if plant-based alternatives to dairy are actually a threat or a potential opportunity. I wanted to start the talk by setting the stage and explaining what is a plant-based diet. That generally is it's a kind of diet where foods and beverages are mostly derived from plants. That, of course, they include vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, and fruits. But some of this plant-based diet may actually include some animal-based products. For instance, one kind of plant-based diet is the so-called flexitarian diet, which includes, among other things, occasionally meat, poultry or fish, but also dairy and other animal-based foods. And then, of course, we have the famous vegetarian and vegan diets where with the latter, of course, they do not consume any animal food or drinks, but the former, they might consume dairy or other products depending on a subcategory of the diet. Now the question is, why would somebody choose to follow a plant-based diet? Well, for a plenty of different reasons. Some people, and we'll see more in the next slides, may have particular health concerns about animal-based foods. Some, they may have some ethical concerns about the treatment of animals, so they decide to go fully plant-based for this reason. Some, they might have environmental concerns. For others, it might just be a matter of taste, in the sense they just prefer the taste of plant-based alternatives. And some, they may actually be under the social pressure, you know, for friends, or since it's a clear trend now, those plant-based diets, they just wanted to try and then they decide to switch to them. But overall, plant-based diet, they are seen in a positive light. But there's still some barriers where some people could decide instead not to consume them. And again, it could be related to health concerns. but most of the times it's simply people are unwilling to give up eating meat because they like it so much, or drinking dairy, for instance. If we look at the case of South Africa, just to start, we see that even in this country, despite being a nation of meat lovers, a lot of South African and more South Africans are opting for a vegan and a plant-based lifestyle. And you can see from the graph to the right that there's a significant increase in launches in plant-based alternatives in a different set of categories, not only dairy, that is been increasing a lot in the past year. You see plus 300%. And you see that 60% of South Africans adults agree that plant-based foods are better for the environment than meat and dairy products. And this is well in line with the global trend that we're seeing, because as I mentioned before, one of the reasons why people could opt for switching to plant-based diet is because of environmental and sustainability related issues. For instance, we see from the survey that 73% of consumers are eating less meat because they believe it is more sustainable. But although the percentage could be different, but it could be also related to applicable to dairy, where people would decide to go plant-based alternatives because of concerns to the environment. But it's not just a matter of what people think or what they decide to do when they switch to plant-based diet. It's also a matter of what food-based dietary guidelines recommend to do. If we see here, I just selected some examples of national guidelines from different countries all around the globe. But overall, there's agreement that plant-based products, in particular vegetables, for instance, are highly recommended by global guidelines. And some they even suggest to consume less meat, for instance, and switch to plant-based alternatives. If we look at the science, we see that in the past 30 years or so, there's been a big increase in scientific publications that they reference plant-based somehow, but especially if you see in the graph, in the past 5 years, more or less, the curve has gone very steep and has increased in amount of, there's been an increase in amount of papers that have been published in the subject, quite a lot. And this, once again, gives another point of view of how this trend is actually increasing and spreading through different kind of points of view. So what some of this science says is that there are actually some health benefits that are associated with plant-based eating versus conventional diets, for instance. So we see here that overall 8 to 25% reduced risk of coronary heart disease has been shown in some studies, 18% of reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, 8 to 15% reduced risk of cancer even, but overall just a better body weight status, metabolic and gut health. So one could have a question on how can plant-based diets improve health compared to conventional diets. And this is mostly due to the nutritional properties of these products, that they're usually higher in beneficial nutrients, such as fibers or phytochemicals, through also a reduction of red meat consumption, but also, again, because generally those products, they have lower amounts of saturated fats, which are being correlated with problems such as coronary heart disease and type 2 diabetes, for instance. Another reason that I wanted to point out why different consumers may choose to go plant-based instead of animal-based, in particular related to dairy, is the problem of lactose intolerance or malabsorption in general. And here we see from this map there is a global distribution of lactose malabsorption in different countries. And besides a few exceptions in the northern countries, we can see that overall there's quite a high percentage of lactose malabsorption in different countries. So this concern in people may also bring them to go either fully or at least partially plant-based. So this could be simply another reason why people choose to do so. But at the same time, although we've shown that plant-based diet and plant-based products could have some benefits, we have to be careful when we actually look at this, because there's some considerations that we have to make, especially from a nutritional and safety point of view. Because while it is true that a plant-based diet can meet the current recommendation of nutrients, at the same time, it is true that it has to be a diet that has to be very, very well planned. Because if we look at single plant-based alternatives, and we're going to see this in the next slides, there are some nutrients, quite a few actually, of considerations for compared to dairy, for instance, that are lacking, or at least they have to be carefully monitored in those products. For instance, protein, and especially not simply the amount of protein, so the kind of amino acids, so the quality of proteins of these products, the amount of calcium and its bioavailability, omega-3 fatty acids, especially, for instance, if oily fish is not present in the diet. And then, of course, vitamin B12 and zinc and iron, if especially if all animal products are avoided. And indeed, research has shown that the bone mineral density is around 4% lower in vegetarians than in omnivores, at both the femoral neck and the lumbar spine. So, and this is due, of course, because of the kind of diet they have, and mostly and likely lacking of calcium, for instance. And as I said, regarding protein quality is a key factor that has to be monitored when considering going plant-based. From two sides. From one side is as I said, the kind of amino acid content that a protein has, and also the digestibility and availability of protein-rich foods. So also regarding the food matrix in which those proteins are inserted. And indeed, it is the case that to try to match the protein quality of dairy products, for instance, a single plant-based product would be really difficult that would achieve this goal. And in fact, usually what has been done is a combination of different sources of plant-based proteins to try to match and combine them for a balanced protein quality. But it's not always easy. For instance, here I put some examples of plant-based dairy alternatives, and I call it not all that glitters is gold, because at first glance, as we saw in the previous slides, there might be health benefits associated with plant-based diets. There might be sustainability benefits, but if we look at the single products, of course, there are some positive points. For instance, almond is a rich source of vitamin E and B. Similar to coconut oil, it contains vitamin E. But we see also a downside with each one of those alternatives. And most of them they are around the quality of the protein. So some of those alternatives, they are lacking a particular, for instance, essential amino acid, and this is why again they have to be combined to try to match the protein quality of dairy. Here we have at a glance comparison of low-fat cow's milk, for instance, and different plant-based dairy alternatives. And we see immediately how while from macronutrient point of view, for instance, protein, fat, carbohydrates, there might be similarities. It's really at the micronutrient level that the main difference can be seen. And again, it's another proof that shows that a combination of different plant-based alternatives is needed to try to match the quality of dairy, especially cow's milk, of course. Especially as we mentioned before, for some micronutrients, for instance, calcium and vitamin B12, for instance. But regardless, at this point, the market of plant-based milk is actually growing at a very fast rate, much faster than what is dairy-based counterpart is going at. But the overall market, of course, is still much higher for dairy milks. And a couple of interesting points, in my opinion, from this graph is that one is that there's still a pretty different geographical distinction, in the sense that in countries like Asia Pacific and Middle East and Africa, the trend of plant-based alternatives are not that much on the rise yet. And also the other interesting point is that both dairy and consumer packaged companies are actually including plant-based milk products in their portfolio to match them or to give a broader alternative to the consumers to pick from. Another challenge that it could be associated with non-dairy alternatives is related to potentially technological issues in terms of formulation. Of course, it's not only difficult to replicate or try to mimic the nutritional quality of dairy foods, especially milk, but it's also difficult to replicate the texture of milk. So, for instance, and dairy more in general. For instance, to have a very creamy texture and rich taste with plant-based alternatives, usually it's needed, a more complex formulation is needed in terms also of the kind of proteins. And this, what usually does, it makes the ingredient list of those products longer, and way longer sometimes than the dairy counterpart. And what that does, of course, that affects somewhat the clean label part of those alternatives. But still, it's the trend is there, but it's something to be considered, that it's another challenge with plant-based non-dairy alternatives. Another a new challenge that perhaps not everybody is aware of is from a strictly, let's say, analytical point of view. Because of course, when we switch from dairy to plant-based alternatives, we're gonna have to look for more from a food safety perspective, from different contaminants or pesticides, for instance, heavy metals that we are not usually looking at, or at least not at this scale with dairy products. So the list here is also very dependent on the source of the plant that we are analyzing. But you see from this quick infographics from Eurofins that depending on the source, there could be more or less markers to go and check compared to dairy, for instance. But if we go to the dairy counterpart, actually, we see that dairy consumption is still very much recommended by global food-based dietary guidelines. So in a way, like plant-based foods are recommended by food-based guidelines, also dairy consumption is very highly recommended by global food-based guidelines. Here, again, I put just some examples, but the situation is pretty much very similar globally. And we see that in some countries, they also recommend to make dairy consumption a third of the diet, or some places a fourth, but still it's quite a big part of the diet following food-based dietary guidelines is highly recommended. And this usually is because, again, the amount and the quality of the protein, but also the micronutrients and the bioactive compounds present in dairy foods. So it's about nutrition and health at the same time. But perhaps the surprising thing is that even though those recommendations are still in place, the consumption of milk globally is decreasing, and it's been decreasing over time. Here is just a snapshot of a study from the US, but although the numbers change, the situation more or less is comparable in different countries. But an interesting thing is that if we go a little bit deeper and we actually split the consumption of milk, and we look at the different kind of milks, we see that there are some differences actually. It is true that consumption of oat milk has been decreasing over time, especially since the 1990s. But if we look at other kinds of milk, for instance, reduced fat or low fat or skim, it's been, of course, with still some up and downs, it's been relatively plateaued over time. So, and this perhaps it could be connected also to why some people decide to go plant-based is because of the fat, and usually the amount of saturated fats that is lower in plant-based alternatives. And here we see how the reduced fat versions of dairy are still pretty consistent over time, while whole milk has been decreasing. Again, another perhaps surprising fact is that although milk consumption, whole milk consumption has been declining over time, overall the dairy consumption is not. And this is explained, and it's actually the opposite is on the rise, especially in the past 20 years or so. And this is driven mostly by cheese and yogurt consumption. And so this could be a way of dairy companies to differentiate and leverage on. But then if we ask the question, we saw that some people, and we saw that some people decide to go plant-based, and then we saw the milk consumption is increasing over time. But then we would like to know who's switching from dairy to plant-based beverages. So if we ask different kind of consumers, for instance, dairy consumers, flexitarian, but also plant-based, and we ask them how likely they are to substitute a plant-based alternative for the traditional dairy product, we'll see how, perhaps not surprisingly, how the dairy consumers, they're not likely at all to switch from their dairy beverages to a plant-based alternative, while flexitarians and plant-based consumers are likely or somewhat likely to think about it and switch. So this is an interest, and this doesn't change. More or less, it remains the same if we look at different food or beverages categories. And this is interesting because it highlights how some consumers are not willing to change at all, and those are the ones that they still, for the dairy consumers, they're gonna be still consuming dairy. But while a good chunk of others, they're actually thinking about, for whatever reason, to substitute dairy for a plant-based alternative. And indeed, if we then look at the market data, we see confirmation of this, because just in 2020, 8% of all food and drink launches globally were actually plant-based. And here you see the distribution in different food categories, but just look at what's happening in TEMEA, that across all those categories, the number of plant-based innovation has grown by 25%. So it's something that, again, it's happening. It's happening fast for different reasons, but depending on the subcategory of dairy, there's also a growth of some particular subcategories, for instance, cheese and yogurt at the same time. But perhaps for this reason, dairy companies are actually including in their portfolio to somewhat welcome this alternative, and instead of making it an enemy, if it makes sense, to give a broader choice to their consumers in terms of both dairy and plant-based alternatives, because in a way they could actually complement each other, as they are both recommended by food-based dietary guidelines. So here I just put some examples, but from different parts of the world, but they're in different categories. But there's many more, and I'm sure you're aware of more. But just to give a snapshot of some of them. So overall, I hope I showed that the trend towards plant-based diets and also plant-based alternatives does not appear to be ending or decreasing. It's actually the opposite. It's growing, and it looks like it's here to stay for some time. And this has been happening for, as I said, for many reasons. It could be health benefits, nutritional reasons, but also related to ethical or sustainability reasons. But from on the other side, also dairy consumption, because of nutritional and health benefits, is still highly recommended by global food-based guidelines. And dairy foods are still have a superior texture if we compare the amount of ingredients needed to achieve the texture compared to their plant-based alternatives. So overall, I think dairy and plant-based alternatives have the potential of coexisting in a flexitarian diet, leveraging on each other's strength points. So they don't have to be complete enemies, and this is witnessed by also the fact that many dairy companies are actually welcoming more plant-based alternatives in their portfolio. So with that, I thank you very much. Here's my contacts, and please reach out if you need to, if you would like to discuss this further. But of course, now we're gonna have question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Davide. That was a really well-balanced presentation and gave us a good overview of the plant-based versus the dairy. I think there is a lot of confusion in where plant-based dairies fit into the diet, and that we need to communicate this extensively to consumers to ensure that they know where it fits in. Just a question, with the work that you've done, have you seen a trend to veganism under a specific age group? That certain age groups move more to veganism than other age groups?
Yeah, honestly, I'm not a market researcher, but from, so I don't have data supporting this, but just by heart, I see that younger generations are more leaning towards this trend, as maybe I mentioned in the beginning, perhaps by social pressures, because friends, they do it too, or because on TV or some influencers, a lot of influencers now, they're vegan or vegetarian, so this could have a big influence on them. So again, I don't have data supporting this, but this is something that I'm seeing, and I think it could be part of the reason why younger generations go vegan or plant-based more in general.
And in your work, have you seen much of the lab-developed products come across and do you think that the that they, with great development, could in the bioavailability of those products. Do you think there might be something there that it could not, I don't think, match dairy, but be as good as?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question and topic. I think it could be, I mean, from a scientific and technological point of view, it's very exciting. It's very promising, actually. If you look just at the numbers and, you know, at the nutrients and what they'll be able to achieve, I think it's amazing. In my opinion, one potential problem is how to communicate that to the consumers and how to make them maybe change or at least buy that product, because I think the communication will be a little difficult with the consumer with those kind of products.
Mm-hmm. You did expand on this in your talk, but about the reasons people choose plant-based. Would you like to talk a bit more about why people choose to go plant-based?
Yeah. Yeah, as I said, this could be for really a variety of different reasons, from ethical concerns. I care a lot about animals, so I don't feel like eating animals or drinking any animal product. From sustainability concerns, some people think that their alternatives or meat alternatives could be better for the planet, so they go with them. Other reasons could be nutrition-related reasons. They may have read somewhere that plant-based diets may have health benefits, so they decide to go fully plant-based without maybe considering there could be something in between. So yeah, very different reasons. And again, social reasons, cultural reasons too. Yeah.
There's some questions coming in here. I've got one that says, what are the most emerging sources of protein?
The major sources of protein in the diet?
Yeah, I think I would guess it's in development of alternatives.
Yeah, well, for instance, related to dairy, we saw how different plant-based foods, like classically it was soy, but then other kind of plant-based sources like almond or other nuts and seeds, they came in. And in fact, now there's even in different statistics, they divide into soy alternatives or non-soy alternatives to show how the trend is actually moving a little bit away from soy now. But I guess the new ones are more related to mushrooms, I saw. Not in beverages, not much, but in terms of protein sources more in general. Mushrooms and yeah, I wanted to say insects, but that's but that's another trend that is not related to this webinar, but it's something related to sustainability, for instance.
I'll jump in here, guys. Hi, Christine. Hi, David. So some of the trends we're seeing is specifically with dairy, with regards to protein, are around like fava bean, chickpea, pea itself. So those vegan sources of protein are definitely becoming more and more popular globally.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll find protein in most things to make some kind of milk alternative. I've got another question here. It says, incomes also play a role why dairy is preferred rather than plant-based. When is this picture going to change? I think that is a guessing.
Yeah, can you say it again?
That incomes, so the income of people also play a role why dairy is preferred rather than plant-based. Obviously, because plant-based is more expensive. Do you think this picture is going to change, and how soon do you think this picture is going to change?
Yeah, indeed, that's a really good question. It is true that usually plant-based alternatives are more expensive. That could be depending on the source, but as I said, maybe even depending on the amount of ingredients that they're present in the product. So that could be a reason why people don't switch. Is it going to change? I guess it's going to depend also on how fast this trend is going to keep growing. So in terms of the availability, usually if it gets to even global scale, that could help to bring down the price. But I'm not sure, because some of those products are seen, and again, I'm not a market researcher, but some of those products are seen somewhat having as a premium value. So usually premium value products, they can be very, very cheap as a staple food, for instance. But of course, there's a lot of variation. But let's say I would be surprised if the price will match at some point.
Yeah, I think it's a bit difficult. And I also think, I was just thinking about the other day, you know, just there's examples that parents said to their children, and we always promote dairy consumption, especially for children, although across the life phases. But if you open your fridge and there's an almond milk you bought only for the adults and the dairy milk only for the kids, then it might become a problem over time that kids think, well, I also want what mom and dad's drinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
I have another question here. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I work in the sensory field. Do you think taste is ever a driver to choose plant-based over dairy?
Yeah, also my background is in taste, so it's a really good question. And to be honest, you know, it could be, you know, how different people think in different ways, but I wouldn't put in the top 5 reasons, let's say. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
And it's always, dairy is always the easy way to say it's not only convenient, but it's so tasty. I mean, you've got a lot of choices. Yes, yes. One of our panelists would like to ask a question. Yompi, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Christine. Yeah, and thank you, Davide. It's very interesting too and very informative. I've got just one question, and it's a very common phenomenon in South Africa, is where you get a combined product consisting of plant-based ingredients like fats and proteins, but also of which the dominated product is dairy. So you will, for example, get a 27-30% plant-based fat in that product. Now, some companies will do that for perhaps a financial benefit, as such products normally contain a little bit less protein or dairy protein for that argument. But have you had any experience with regards to products which is now combined, finding its place in the market space specifically for flexitarians? Do you see any trends in that respect?
So I'm a nutritional scientist, so I can't really speak about the market trends, but I can also say that it's something that I've seen, and I think that sometimes it's also a different way to try to convince both sides. So it's a way to it's a marketing way sometimes to convince both parties about a single product, but also at the same time it could be a good idea from a nutritional point of view to have a different nutritional profile, but also to bring innovation in the product. And I think this goes hand in hand on the final message on how dairy and non-dairy alternatives could coexist, not only by having different products within the same portfolio, so plant-based and non-plant-based, but also something that is somewhat in between. I think it could help.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. I just thought I would comment on one of your slides when you were saying that the consumption of dairy is declining. It's always, but of dairy, of milk, dairy is always increasing. But it's also nice to see in South Africa that, just as a comment, that pasteurized milk is declining, but UHT milk is usually increasing, and we think it's from a convenience factor, the fact we don't need refrigeration. So that's still a very positive. And also here that we have Mars, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is fermented milk, also is quite a popular and growing in our country, which is great to see.
Yep.
I'm not seeing any more questions. Adele, do we wrap this up now? This has been a fantastic session. Thank you, Davide. I think it's everybody. I've had some comments here on my WhatsApp about it, and I think it's been a great session and so needed to talk about the comparisons. It's been such a nice balanced view. I think as dairy people, we have to remember and remind them that we are not in a battle. That's the most important thing. We're not in a battle. We're here to give the facts as it is, but also to ensure that any plant food can only taste better with dairy. So it's not just us saying it because we love dairy, but I think it is a fact that you're not only adding mouthfeel. I also come from a bit of a sensory background, so it's like mouthfeel. And now we have especially on the cheeses and some of the higher fat products, that the increased risk of saturated fats in dairy does not increase your risk of heart disease. So that's also nice of a health perspective to be able to promote your dairy products. From my side, I would just thank you very much. It's a great webinar from the technology to SASDT. And if there are any other questions, we will forward them to you. Over to you, Adele.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Christine. David, thank you so much for that interesting presentation. Christine, and I was glad that you said that in terms of with everything that's going on, we just want to give through the best information and the correct information. And thank you to the SASDT for getting Tate and Lowell to sponsor this with the topic and with the presenter. We just want to let you know that should you want to listen or watch any of the previous webinars that was hosted by the SASDT, they are available on the SASDT website as well as on Food Focus. If you go to Food Focus website, www.foodfocus.co.za, you will be able, under resources, to get a drop down that says webinar, where you will find all the webinars that were recorded last year, and this one will also be available with a PDF of the presentation. So thank you very much. Please note, after I'm going to press the stop button, there's a short survey, 3 short questions. Please answer them so that we can provide the information to the SASDT and make sure that we focus the upcoming webinars on the topics of that you would like to know more of. So have a pleasant afternoon, and thank you to everybody that signed in. And until the next time, thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.